In Metro DC, government drives 40% of the economy, employs millions, and has global impact. It also makes for some interesting stories. They say breakfast is the most important meal of the day, but what happens when that day gets scrambled? For GovExec TV, I'm George Jackson, and welcome to Scramble, Lessons in Government Leadership. In August of 2021, Dr. Stacey Dixon was sworn in as Principal Deputy Director of National Intelligence. Her first few weeks on the job were intense, punctuated by the United States' complete withdrawal after 2 decades of war in Afghanistan, and a large buildup of Russian troops along the Ukrainian border. In this episode of Scrambled, Dixon talks about how she navigated those crises, how she managed the pressure, the long-term impact on the intelligence community, and more. This episode brought to you by GovTribe, a comprehensive suite of tools for government contractors. Know more, win more with GovTribe. Dr. Stacey Dixon is Principal Deputy Director of National Intelligence. Ma'am, thanks for being here.
George, it's great to be here.
So, DC native, we are in the iconic Metro 29 diner in Arlington, Virginia. Have you ever been to this place?
I've never been here, but I'm really excited to be here with you today.
Well, I'm pumped up to have breakfast with you here in a little bit, but before we get there, let's talk about Scrambled. Back August 2021, you're entering a new role. Take me back. What's the context of the challenge you were up against?
So when I became the Principal Deputy Director of National Intelligence in August of 21, if you recall, the country was preparing for the military and diplomats and others to withdraw from Afghanistan. That happened 2 weeks after I arrived at ODNI, and that was sort of the beginning of what has been one very large effort after another, one crisis after another for our community.
Who were the stakeholders involved in such a massive endeavor there?
That one touched on many, many people. So it was the Department of Defense, as I mentioned, the Department of State, but it was also other government agencies that were there, USAID, for example, international partners that were there that were looking to the U.S. to help them get their citizens also out of Afghanistan. Afghanistan was just sort of the beginning, though. We sort of go a couple more months, and then we have this large buildup of troops that we noticed around Ukraine, and that became what later was Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and so we went from one event to the other.
I'd love to tie those two together later on in our conversation, Afghanistan and Ukraine. I think that's a really important point, but let's go back to August of 21. You weren't new to the IC, the intelligence community. What kind of background did you have going into that role, and what were some of the key elements in that background that when you arrived, you were greeted with an Afghanistan, crisis or situation or whatever word you want to apply there? What prepared you for that moment?
So when I started there, I'd been about 18 years in the community, so definitely not a novice. Had worked for several of the intelligence agencies, so had worked for CIA, had worked for National Reconnaissance Office, and then NGA, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. So I had a good sense of several of the organizations that made up the information, that delivered the information that we then provided to policymakers and others. So having that foundation of working across the community was extremely important, because nothing as large as that had ever happened before, the withdrawal, and really did take all members of our community working together with others to get it done. And while everyone can go back and look at it, and of course there are things you can do better and lessons you can learn, it was an effort that really made a difference in the lives of a lot of people, and was just sort of a reminder of how important and critical intelligence can be to supporting many of the things happening in the world.
That mission objective that you allude to, and I know I'm paraphrasing there, but what was on the other end of that mission objective, maybe both for the United States, the intelligence community, the Department of Defense, but also like the people impacted on the other end? What was the mission objective associated with what you were taking on?
Get people out safely, get people out quickly, and for those Afghan partners who were relocating to the U.S., making sure that we could do that safely, both safely for our country, but also safely for the individuals, and hopefully have a very good life for individuals once they come, after all that they've done to support both the military, our community, and others for many, many years in Afghanistan.
Paint me a picture, Dr. Dixon, of, okay, you're in August of 21, you're sitting at your desk, maybe you have a standing meeting at the top of the day. Like, what were the actions associated with starting to tackle such a big issue head on?
And you mentioned it, so you start the day with the meeting with all the players at the table. And that would happen in many, many different places in the government in general, but in terms of the intelligence community, we would start with our organization, but you would very, very quickly have the same sort of meeting with our DoD counterparts, with others who had personnel in Afghanistan, with others who could help shed light on what was happening and how are we going to manage all this transportation and how are all these things happening. So you have to have the people at the table willing to work together and everyone kind of understanding the scope of not only their own particular, how many people they had, how much equipment they had, how are they going to get things out of the country, but you actually had to have that conversation happening for many different organizations at the same time, and those relationships that we have within the community became very, very apparent. And I would say the same thing as we went into other crises. It's always about who's at the table, having the conversations, using the authorities that they have to be able to achieve whatever outcome we were trying to achieve, and that was definitely on display during that time.
Leadership is not a one-size-fits-all thing, but all leadership, I think, involves communication to a great degree. Can you talk a bit about how you employ a communication style as you lead an organization like ODNI or like NGA?
I have a very collaborative approach. So I really enjoy hearing the inputs from people who are stakeholders who have something to not only offer to whatever it's we're trying to achieve, but who are probably going to be impacted by it. And it can take a little bit longer to come up with a solution that works for everyone. But I feel like the better solutions are when you have more people at the table contributing their thoughts and ideas, their experiences. So I have a very, very collaborative leadership style. And I think the other deputies across our 18-element community, we really do work well together. There's some wonderful people in these roles who not only want to take care of their own workforce, but really see our community as a community and know that the things that we can accomplish when we work together are beyond what any one agency can do.
We've talked before about things like artificial intelligence, for example. ODNI and the rest of the intelligence community have a lot of data at their fingertips, and that's all across government at this point. How do you analyze information? How do you ask the right questions of people, but also of data when you're starting to address a challenge like Afghanistan and the withdrawal?
I'll talk a little bit more broadly than just that particular one, because I think there's some other examples of the data that would be really useful to bring forward. And you're right, the intelligence community has a lot of data. We've been collecting data and intelligence for decades across our community. The challenge, of course, is that no one envisioned early on when you're collecting all this data, this idea of artificial intelligence. And so if you would think back, 70 plus years ago when intelligence community was created, there really wasn't anything like this around. And so people would collect data. But now we know that the data needs to be conditioned. It needs to be tagged. It needs to be in a format that makes it useful for artificial intelligence. And that is one thing that I think we're working on. We're doing that going forward. I think we'll have the right formats, but now we have to go back and retroactively make data more useful for the tools we have available today.
I would imagine that, and I'm not just limiting it to the Afghanistan withdrawal, but situations where there is a big challenge, a big mission objective like that, there are probably contrary views at those stand-up meetings, at the table. How do you like to approach those issues? How do you like that information delivered? Do you appreciate people coming in and being really passionate in the opposite of what, maybe conditioned thought is?
Absolutely. I think one of our jobs is to make sure that if there are differences of opinion, if there are different perspectives on something that's going to happen or something that did happen, that we elevate that, because people who have to make policy, people who have to make decisions based on our information need to know if there's a dissent. And we're doing our job best if we elevate that and make sure that it is very clear that the entire community was not on board with whatever the conclusion is. So it's rare that you have everyone actually believing the exact same thing, especially in the beginning when you may have more gaps, for example, in the intelligence that you have. As you gather more information, you tend to get to a point where you do have more consensus, but not always, and that's okay. We don't have to be a community where consensus is the required outcome. We're a community where we want the best intelligence, the best information for those that need it to be the right outcome.
I'd love to talk for a bit about pressure. Okay. Maybe how you manage pressure in time periods like that. One of my mentors here in the public sector arena, Jim Williams, former acting administrator of General Services Administration and several other positions, have kind of compared the pressure of being a leader at your level of government to having the sword of Damocles hanging over your head. There's a lot of eyeballs on it. How do you deal with it? Do you have any advice for rising government leaders who kind of want to get in the same sphere as you?
You have to pace yourself, number one, especially with the crises that seem to not completely end or that they continue and new ones come on top of them. So if you look around the world, there's just a lot of things happening, and you could burn yourself out on any one of those crises. But recognizing that there's always going to be something happening, you've got to pace yourself. You also have to recognize that your information is not perfect, right? We're not telling the future. We're actually explaining what the intelligence shows us. And yes, there are going to be people who disagree with us. There are going to be people who are upset by what we tell them, but that's our job. Our role is to make sure we're painting that picture, not telling people what they want to hear. We're just painting the picture of what we see, what we've heard, what we've collected over time. We have to withstand any attempts to have us change the analysis to fit a particular perspective. And that's something that we talk about a lot. And there are opportunities for our workforce to come forward when they feel challenged or when they feel like something that they thought was happening or something that they put in the analysis was changed in a way that makes them concerned. And so we make sure that we have that opportunity for people to talk it through, especially when we're as busy as we are. We can't have people worried that their own perspective or that they haven't been allowed to do their jobs.
Do you have to go into situations like that with an assumption that at least something small is going to go wrong? And maybe I'll make a comparison because you have a very strong information technology background to the way people view cybersecurity these days. You know, a breach will ultimately happen. These borders online are not impermeable. For a big challenge, do you have to assume that something small is going to go wrong?
I guess, and thinking back through it, I suppose the answer should be yes. I mean, certainly in the sense that the example you gave with cybersecurity, as much as you put your efforts into trying to keep things secure, inevitably something will happen, and you've got to be ready for that. And it still disappoints you when it does, because you thought you've done everything that you could do. The same token, there's always going to be either something that you don't see in advance in our community or something that, frankly, happens even though you had the best intelligence possible. And in those cases, you just have to sort of regroup and continue to do the job, continue to figure out what the gaps are and see if you can make sure that you can learn from whatever lesson happened in that particular crisis and apply it to the next one so that you're always growing, always making sure that you're trying to do better the next time around than you did in that particular time. I think that's how I would answer that one. So we don't necessarily go into it thinking something's going to go wrong, but you've got to be ready in the event that it does, and it probably will more likely than not.
The pace of change in my conversations all across government, it seems to really be picking up, you know, exponentially as the years go along. How is that something that, as a leader, you manage, you advise the people who you have to enlist in large initiatives like this to manage? How do you manage the pace of change?
I'm pretty excited about change. I'm pretty excited about technology and what it can do for our mission, but it can be quite a disruptor when it comes to people who have been doing something a certain way for a long period of time. I think part of the conversation we have with them is there's nothing wrong with the way that we used to do things, but because of the pace of change, because of the demand that's on our community and the demand that's on our customers, we have to figure out how to do things more efficiently, more quickly, and more accurately. And technology can often help with that, or doing things in a different way can help with that. And so that's the starting point. It's not that what we were doing was bad before. It's just that the time now calls for something different, and there are tools out there that can help us. So taking the time to learn how to use them, taking the time to partner with those who are more aware of how those tools can help mission is something that I encourage people. And then celebrating it. You know, when I see someone come up with a project or a algorithm or a tool that will save hours, hundreds and hundreds of hours for something that used to be done manually, we celebrate it. We have to acknowledge it and make sure others know about it, and then see how we can scale it to help out others as well.
Talk about the long-term impact, and this may get back to our earlier part of the conversation where you referenced Ukraine, but August 2021, the way that you managed the Afghanistan crisis, what's the long tail there? How has it changed things either for the organization or for government more broadly?
I would say between those two things, we learned a couple things. One was our community needs to be strong, and we need to figure out how to work together, and whoever has information that seems to paint a picture of what's going to happen next, making sure that that information gets out to the widest possible audience as quickly as possible. In the case of Ukraine, when the Russian troops were building up around Ukraine, that was when the administration decided that enough partners and frankly the world weren't watching it and seeing what the intelligence community was seeing, and that there was a need to make others aware that there was a possibility that there would be an invasion. The goal, of course, was to not have there be an invasion, and unfortunately that was not stopped, but the world was a lot more aware. That and put our community in the spotlight, in the sense that now our intelligence becomes part of more public discourse about crises when they're happening. And that was quite a change for our community that I think we haven't shied away from. We've figured out how to manage it a lot better than we did in those early days, but it's still a tension point between those of us who grew up knowing that we needed to protect information and others who know that that information will either help the public understand what's happening, help other leaders understand what's happening. So it's been a balance that we continue to learn, and we continue to try to create processes to make it easier the next time around to have the same sort of hard conversations we're having to have now.
Is that type of transparency something that you feel like you've helped usher into ODNI? And I ask because the National Geospatial-Intelligence Agency for several years had to, manage this shift where large commercial satellite providers are now out there, and a lot of what they're doing is public, and to stay relevant, to stay ahead of the curve, NGA had to move in a much more public domain. Do you see comparisons there with ODNI?
I never thought about it, but absolutely. We definitely learned that in NGA earlier, I think, than others because of the very great capabilities that commercial industry was bringing to bear on the geospatial mission. I think now other agencies are having to experience a bit of what NGA did. Not only are there other great commercial capabilities that are out there that we can use within our community, but there's now a lot more opportunity for a different kind of conversation when we share what we can while protecting the sources and protecting our methods, but share what we can so that the Department of Defense, the State Department, the President, and the cabinet members can all have more informed conversations with their counterparts. You start seeing the power of a common intelligence picture is what we call it, but you start seeing the power of that when you see others change their perspective on what they see happening in the world based on conversations they have with our community or based on the data from our community.
Okay, let's go off script here a little bit, and I know that's scary, but these are not really related to the intelligence community. Your mentors, take me back either through your career or maybe before it, somebody that really showed you what it's like or why it's important to be a leader.
I have worked with some really great people who were able to take very disparate skill sets and figure out how to make a cohesive team, one that people wanted to be part of, one that felt very accomplished when it achieved whatever the outcome was. And I've been very lucky in that regard. So I know not everyone has that experience, but I've worked with some really great leaders. And I've also worked with some really great peers who we weren't in competition. They supported my career and what I wanted to do. I supported theirs. And one of the best things I've had people do for me is to recommend that I apply for a job, recommend that I take on a new project, something that I wasn't necessarily ready to do on my own, but through their encouragement was something that I decided to go ahead and either volunteer for or apply for. And while I didn't necessarily get all of those opportunities, the ones I did have definitely, in hindsight, really benefited my career. And so I wanted to create places where we have a workforce that looks out for each other in that way and is able to not only celebrate other people's achievements, but encourage them to do more than maybe they thought they could even do.
Okay, and let's flip that now. Somebody comes to you, Dr. Stacey Dixon, ODNI, really storied career. How do you advise to them, here's how you get from point A to point B? Are there common things that you advise them to take on or be open to, maybe a book that they should read? Like, what advice do you impart to them?
Probably the best advice that I got, and it's the advice that I continue to give to others, is to be open to opportunities that don't look like the opportunity that you thought was coming. So a lot of times we create this image of our career, and it's very linear. We've got this job, and the next job there's only one next job. There's only one job after that. And in reality, there are a lot of different ways you can achieve success in whatever area you work. For me, I think I have moved around to different agencies. I've moved around into different work roles, and that's what's benefited me. And so I encourage people to, when they get those opportunities, to do a lateral assignment. So one where you're not getting a promotion, but you're just moving along in the same grade, but that teaches you new skills that can be beneficial later on. Don't shy away from taking those. When you think about what your future opportunities are, literally think about what jobs you want to have 3, 5, 10 years, and then think about what skills you need to have along the way, and then figure out how to build your career that way. So be very, very intentional in the way that you're thinking about your career and recognizing there's not one way to get to where you want to get.
A lot of the advice or the leadership sort of guidance that you've imparted during the course of this discussion, I think, is accessible to nearly everybody. Is there a sort of unique set of parameters when you're advising on leadership to folks who want to build their career like you have in the public sector?
I don't know that it is unique to the public sector. I think you have to understand the different organizations and the different bureaucracies that exist within them to figure out where you can best apply your own skill sets and where you have the most opportunities. But I could see this kind of advice being very useful for others. I would say in the public sector, we have different rules that we live under within the public sector. We have different rules that we live under within particular agencies, and you have to know those. But the advice itself could probably be applicable quite outside the public sector.
Well, Dr. Stacey Dixon, Principal Deputy Director of National Intelligence, ma'am, thanks so much for your time. Thank you for starting your day with us for GovExec TV. I'm George Jackson. Breakfast, my favorite. Let's eat.